thing that we discussed earlier is the incredible insight that comes in from the Harris poll. So, Page Society, very well known for its insight. And one of the findings I thought was really surprising, and I wanted to ask you what you thought about how the trust in generative AI now surpasses trust in social media. When people are searching for information about brands, tell us about that, because that was completely new to me.
Yeah, that was a surprise to so many in our
Mm.
survey this year that when you look at where consumers go for information, um, you didn't used to think about generative AI, but when you look at what fastest growing source of trusted information, people are going to generative AI, things like where you actually have to go search for the information.
Hmm.
And now generative AI search engines, about 50% of consumers across
Wow.
markets, talking 14 major markets, 50% trust AI versus only 49% in general trust social media. Facebook, 44%, Instagram, 45%. So there is a shift going on. Something, if it's not in people's media mix, then you need to change it up.
Gosh, and when you talk about these generative AI, you're talking about, ChatGPT, Perplexity, Claude, Gemini. That's really, really quite extraordinary. It really is.
It is, and it varies according to market too.
Oh.
And so not every country trusts AI or uses AI to search up
Hmm.
information about companies in the same way. And so some countries have much less trust in AI. So if you're a global brand, you need to definitely be aware of that and adjust things accordingly. So like in the UK, like where you are,
Mm.
it's not trusted. So
Oh, we don't
search
trust anyone
engine,
here.
word of mouth, right? Going directly to consumer ratings and all of that are trusted much more. So when you look at the top 10 information sources, AI in the UK is not popping up. But then you go
Mm.
to other countries like China and you look at some of the other developing markets, which I found extremely interesting, that the countries where confidence in business is highest,
Yeah.
those are the countries that are ranking going directly to dedicated generative AI tools within their top seven. So you look at Saudi Arabia is the
Hmm.
seventh most used place where you would go look for information. UAE, the sixth. India, the sixth.
Mm.
Brazil, the fifth most used media source. So when you are working on global brands, and you're
Hmm.
trying to reach people in different markets, your strategy needs to vary. And a lot of people need to think about that.
Take me through that. So, what does a brand do, especially if it's a global brand? If someone prompts AI with my company name, and let's say the answer is wrong or outdated, which happens all the time, and we've seen that through
Or
Wikipedia
even worse, not there.
and not there, right? Or ranks below where it ought to rank. Elon should be at the top for North Carolina.
For
How
university.
hard, the university, how hard is that to fix?
So it's multiple things. One is you have to be ongoing, not just media monitoring, but now you need to be using the various search generative AI engines to find out what's being said about your brand, about your products, about the issues that you care about. And then if your information is coming up incorrect, then you need to be going directly to the sources and helping them to understand what is true, showing it with action, like what's actually being done, and providing the context. But you also need to make sure that your content that you're providing is generative AI optimized. So GEO, just like you had SEO, GEO, how are you telling your stories? How are you making the stories written in a way that the way that people ask questions? And how are you using citations and having other people to cite your work? Because it's all about the citations when you're looking at those generative AI engines. And so knowing what our trusted media sources, earned media still is critical. So it's not like we're ending the earned media game, but you're making sure that they are citing you as an expert, and then you're telling that fuller story on your websites and that people can find it. Even things discoverable we didn't used to think about, but telling really compelling stories.
Hmm.
what you're using for your investor, to those letters that you're writing and the investor letters, making sure those are real stories being told and those are available online. Those can then become discoverable. But it's all about the making sure that you have your content generative AI engine optimized. That's a lot of words.
Now, Rochelle, I wanted to ask a little bit about trust. So these large language models, these generative AI platforms are relatively new.
Mhm.
And back in the day with social media, all these different channels started popping up. Do you think that in the future, people are going to start having a discernment between the different LLMs, between, I don't know, Claude or ChatGPT, in terms of
Mm.
some are trusted more than others? At the beginning of our conversation, you talked about the differences of trust in Facebook versus Instagram, for instance,
Mhm.
both obviously Meta. But are we going to begin to start seeing these LLMs have different sort of trust levels? I mean, already you're seeing, OpenAI and
Mhm.
Anthropic that owns Claude, and they're, and stories about how they are structuring their company in relation to sort of privacy, etc. Is having an impact upon their company reputation. Do you think that's going to trickle down and people are going to start seeing them as individual black brands rather than just this lump of various different sort of LLMs?
Oh, absolutely. I think that you were already beginning to see that. There's a
Mm.
backlash, off of how people are using and what are those guardrails that are being put up. In terms of will your LLM be used, or your AI be used for the defense industry?
Mm,
Are you going to protect children, or are you going to make sure that there's some level of responsibility when it comes to pornography? Because adult content
mm-hmm,
is allowed in some, and others is not. And so
mm-hmm.
consumers are beginning to really think about that,
Yeah.
and make some decisions related to that as well. So when you even think about how consumers are responding, let's use the UK again. And
Yeah.
great example, UK disproportionately, an important issue to them is the regulation of AI.
Mm-hmm. That's
Most
huge.
other country
Huge.
consumers aren't even thinking about that. So go back to your
Mm.
question. Are people going to start distinguishing among the various brands? I would say that's probably going to come faster in a country like UK, which is
Yeah.
calling for, as one of their top 4 issues
Mm-hmm.
that companies need to do something about, is
Yeah.
regulating AI.
Yeah.
So if that's an expectation, then they're probably going to dig deeper down into which LLMs that they're trying to use. Because again, looking at the UK, particularly with the adults,
Mm.
number fifth issue that older adults are concerned about in the UK is the potential negative impacts on by the use of AI.
Mm-hmm.
So the
Mm.
companies that are putting up guardrails, the companies that are holding these AI corporations or media accountable for their actions, I think are also going to be the brands that are going to be stronger as well, because they're doing something about an issue that consumers care about. And
Yeah.
so you are seeing it with how consumers are responding based upon what the AI engines are being used for in the marketplace. You're seeing consumers respond to say, hey, we want regulation. And
Mm-hmm.
hey, we expect companies to do something about not just regulation, but also to do something about the negative impact. Because what we
And
don't want to have happen is
mm,
what you're seeing, all the lawsuits that that the
right.
social media companies are dealing with now because
Right.
Yes.
of their failure to act responsibly.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
think probably these LLMs aren't going to have that sort of free terrain that the social media companies had for quite a long time, because people are much more aware of regulation and the impact of unregulated communication channels. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens with these LLMs. The other thing I wanted to ask you is, you mentioned that it's important for PRs to be thinking about the presence of their organizational brands on these LLMs, and to then make sure that they're accurate. But what about disinformation? What about bad actors who are thinking that actually a lot of search has moved on to these LLMs, and actually we're going to figure out what sources they actually draw from, and then we're going to fuel our disinformation through those channels? Do you see concern around the disinformation aspect, targeting these LLMs as well?
Absolutely. Misinformation is one of the biggest concerns that's on chief communication officers' minds and the
Hmm.
agencies that support them. Because, first, these LLMs also hallucinate and
Yeah.
they make up information and sources that don't exist at times.
Yeah.
And so they bots talking to bots is a concern. So we cannot take the human element out of it. What are the
Hmm.
detection tools that we can find out that if something is a misinformation and where is that source? Where is it coming from? Is it a
Hmm.
hallucination? Is it a malicious actor? And there are a lot of agencies and technology firms that are helping to detect that sort of thing. But you
Mm.
Hmm.
also have to have discernment to know if something is a bot storm that is not even human driven versus something that is a malicious actor that's spreading information and being able to handle crisis situations in a very proactive way. And that's a new tool in people's crisis communications belt that you have to be
Yeah.
able to handle.
I'll give you an example of hallucination and trust in AI. Somebody sent me an RFP last week, and sorry, I'm not crazy about RFPs. I never like
I don't think anyone is.
participate. No, but I was a sub to it, so but I did give it a human
Mm.
scan. Then I did what I think a lot of us would do is I dragged it into Claude, and I had a conversation with Claude and what was in there. And a very key piece of feedback, which I was building to go into the RFP, was a complete and utter hallucination by Claude. And if I had not humanly spent time looking at that, it would have gone through. And when I asked Claude, "What are you doing?" It said, "Oh, you're right. I invented that." But that's still trust in AI, Rochelle. And we're still going to do it because heuristics tell us not that we're lazy, but we'll cut corners.
Well, you cannot take the human out of it. One of the things that Paige has been doing is a partnership with Scriptorium. It's a think tank out of Europe and founded by actually two of our Paige members. And we're looking at what are those risks that are involved with having agentic teams,
Hmm.
and how do you also communicate with agentic stakeholder groups? And you cannot take the human element out of that. We did an experiment at our spring seminar that just happened in New York City back in March, and we created an agentic team, and we're like, how would you handle this case? And it was interesting. Sometimes our agentic agents worked with us.
Hmm.
Sometimes they provided really bad information. But if we were not experienced comms leaders with information from that sector, they could take us off in a really bad direction. So experience remains critical for a chief communications officer or in understanding that sector. So you cannot substitute AI for experience because your experience, Doug, knew, uh,
Hmm.
Pod, you're doing something. But someone who is
Hmm.
inexperienced and has no background knowledge wouldn't know to correct or to question. And so there is an obligation for us as comms leaders to make sure that we reinforce the critical thinking skills, that we reinforce the experience that brings to the table so that we can detect, we can find information that might be misleading and wrong and knowing how to fact check. That's one that, so, I'm coming from higher ed before I became to this role. My God, what is totally important now for these future generations is teaching those skills, those fact checking skills, making sure that there's some critical reasoning skills that go on. And we've got to push that all the way down through K
Hmm.
through 12 to get the youngest, you know, students involved
Yeah.
and having those critical thinking skills.
And Rochelle, you're in this incredible vantage point with the Page Society because your members are the CCOs, the Chief Communication Officers of some of the largest, most influential companies in the world. What I wanted to ask you is what traits and skill sets do you think that PRs need to really start thinking about developing if they want to one day be like these CCOs who are, members of the Page Society? Bearing in mind how things are moving so fast.
Well, you have to continue to have curiosity, one.
Yeah. Yeah.
Folks who are not curious, who are not willing to experiment and to be able to lean into change, that curiosity has to remain. But
Hmm.
the soft skills, those critical thinking skills,
Yeah.
are are the utmost important. That you are taking a skeptical look at information
Hmm.
in order to solve problems. Problem solving skills still become critical. Some of the basic things can be taught, grammar and all of that. AI can help with your spelling,
Yeah.
etc. But is it going to really reach an audience of things that are those conversations that are held offline?
Mm.
Because what happens in the meeting and the conversations that are happening, that nuance thing and connecting things that were not recorded, things
Hmm.
that were said in the hallway, what have you, bringing that information, things that you observe in the real world have to be brought to the table. So you have to be able to take all those senses that you are experiencing and bring it to problem solving, and that you're not relying upon it. And so it sounds like very basic
Mm.
critical thinking, problem solving,
Curiosity.
curiosity. But that person
Mm.
who is able to connect dots will be
Mm.
so much better. The person who's able to make those probes and to have that careful analysis, even though AI will help expedite and make things more efficient,
Hmm.
it's the human that actually makes the decision. It's the human that is going to really understand what that gut check is and has to make the choice.
Now,
So
that's a positive
it,
way to end this conversation,
I
that
love it. Yeah.
humans are still needed, still
Mm.
relevant, and,
For now.
for and judgment as well is so incredibly important, because what you find with all these AI tools is not to outsource your thinking, your critical thinking. You need to have judgment in terms of what you put into the AI tool, and you need to have judgment in terms of how you edit what comes out of the AI tool. And so I think that is still safely with us.
Well, I think it's important. And just think, it wasn't AI that brought us together when we met in the UAE not too long ago. It was human, real interaction, and it builds relationships. Real human interaction builds lasting relationships. Bots can talk to bots, but humans build relationships. Relationships is what makes up the public relations industry. And so we have to keep the humans in the loop to make the decisions, to build the relationships, because that's where trust is going to happen. Got to prove it with
Mm.
action. And Doug, we're going to continue to tell the truth and
Hmm.
tell stories with context, and that'll restore confidence.
Awesome. Thanks so
Awesome.
much for this, Rochelle.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.